The Axial Age is often regarded as the fountainhead of all of what we know as the world religions. You're familiar with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and of course Greek philosophy in the West, Zoroastrianism in Persia, the rise of the ascetics in India, both Hindu and Buddhist and Jain, and of course the sages of China, Confucius, Lao Tzu, Mozi, so on and so forth. What's astounding about the Axial Age, it would appear that there was this brief period in history. Originally, it was dated from 800 BC to 200 BC, so a 600-year period just before the birth of Christ. And if you look at it in terms of what most anthropologists and archaeologists and historians agree is the timeline of humanity, you had a long period of hunter-gatherer culture before the rise of agriculture, and with agriculture coming the god-king states, the archaic states of, say, Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, or Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in India, or the Shang dynasty in China. These were societies which were hierarchical, unlike the hunter-gatherer societies which preceded them. And at the top of that hierarchy, in general, with some exceptions, was a god king, a ruler whose legitimacy was associated with the heavens and whose identity very often was associated with the heavens. What the Axial Age did, seemingly, was break open this rigid structure and allow for the rise of human individuals, thinkers who did not agree on certainly not everything, and some of them not much of anything, but you saw this ferment, this churn of ideas and the production of something novel, something new. The philosopher of technology and historian Lewis Mumford said that the Axial Age established the human personality as more important than its material or institutional agents, meaning that the human personality now had a degree of freedom to operate in a new type of culture, which called into question, and in some cases overturned, that extremely stiff hierarchical culture, the archaic god-king state which came before. Now, this isn't to say that everything was transformed during this period. These were isolated zones across a semi-connected geographical region. You had the Greek philosophers in the Mediterranean. You had the Hebrew prophets in the Levant. You had the Zoroastrian priests in Persia. You had the Hindu ascetics or the Indian ascetics across the Indus River and in the shadow of the Himalayas. And of course, a fair bit farther, the sages of China. When these thinkers emerged, most people on earth wouldn't have known about them. But as these cultures developed, as they began to permeate their respective civilizations, they would become the icons, very familiar icons to most everyone in this room, of everything, again, that we know as today's world religions. This took place over the course of over 2 millennia, and as you well know, as we're all familiar with our new and rapidly changing environment, what is oftentimes thought of as a second axial age is what seems to be unfolding in front of us now, a new emergence of a new type of civilization, and if the transhumanists are correct, a new type of humanity. And if the posthumanists are correct, then a new species altogether, that of artificial life, artificial intelligence, robotics, so on and so forth. But first, the Axial Age. The Axial Age is defined, again, by the human personality. It's also defined by a transcendence, the transcendence of human beings and, in many cases, a soul, the human soul, above material circumstances. It posited a world in which there is some realm beyond the day-to-day survival of humanity, the typical political struggles of humankind, and above that rigid hierarchy. It also, in most cases, from Greece, certainly in the Hebrew culture, certainly in India, and to an extent in China, there was this move towards a one, something that was unified, a force or a god, a being that was beyond the tribal gods, that was beyond the tribal totems, even the more sophisticated Olympian gods, as Plato would put forward. It was also a period in which there was thought about relativity, as we would call it today. Perhaps one's culture that one is born in is not necessarily the most important attribute of oneself. One's bloodline is not necessarily the most important attribute of oneself, but rather one's alignment, one's inner alignment with that transcendent force, with either the Brahman, as the Indians termed it, the Tao, as the Chinese termed it, or God, as Plato termed it, Yahweh, Elohim, as the Hebrews termed it. It was really when what we would now call monotheism kind of came into its own. There was also the rise of new ways of life, new ways of living, so that you had preceding the Axial Age the shamans who would undergo all sorts of strange physical mortification and psychological states, but these were a little less organized, and certainly we don't have a lot of written records of what would have emerged from that. What we do see from the emergence of philosophy in Greece, to a large extent from the prophetic and mystical traditions of the Hebrews, the Zoroastrians, and definitely the Indians, is the rise of asceticism, so that you have organized communities of people, men, and some women in the case of Buddhism and later Christianity, who would dedicate their lives to restricting the 4 F's, right? Feeding, fighting, fucking, fortifying. All of the aspects of the human personality which many or most of these axial age thinkers thought were obstacles or deterrents from reaching that transcendent realm. And because of the example of these ascetic communities, you had, I think, an even more intense restriction of such instinctive or primal desires among the regular citizens of these civilizations, because they were held up as examples. To take one instance, the Buddhists. The Buddhists were an organized community of monastics, unlike anything that had appeared before. And as Buddhism became a normative religious culture, first in India and then throughout Asia and into China, you had this example, you had this new way of life that was now elevated and held up as superior to everything that was going on around it. And these leaders, these thinkers, were able to influence the material culture that obviously still continued going forward. Now I'm going to see if I can get, oh, there we go. Got something going on. Maybe, I'll give you a quick rundown. As long as we have pretty pictures up. No, I'm not. I'm just going to go with the map here. I think that to understand the geography is to get a really good sense of what's happening here, because there are a lot of different theories as to why the axial age would occur so rapidly and so seemingly simultaneously. And you had in the Middle East the Egyptian kingdoms, the origins of what we would know as civilization, the Egyptian kingdoms. Before that, the Sumer and Babylonian kingdoms. You had in India a much smaller, more modest beginning to civilization and urban life. Now the archaeological sites of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And then in China, an ancient civilization which is probably mostly mythical, but still saw itself as this sort of origin of civilization. And it was into that the axial age was born. Two of the thinkers that really influenced my way of really understanding and exploring this period, first, Karl Jaspers, the German philosopher. Jaspers coined the term the Axial Age, and Jaspers would be the one who really identified that period as this transformational moment. His motivation was in the aftermath of World War II, he couldn't really grasp how it is that a religion like Christianity, which holds up a peacemaker, would lead to horrific world wars, fascism, communism, and even the destruction wrought by liberal democracy upon its enemies. And he looked into the historical record, which he had been swimming in all of his adult life as a philosopher, trying to find some answer as to why. Another one is Robert Bellah, the sociologist who actually first introduced me to this idea in 2011 with the publication of his book, Religion and Human Evolution. But I think the one writer that really fleshed out this period for me the most was Karen Armstrong. Karen Armstrong was a nun who left the order in order to pursue a life of scholarship. And what's really valuable about her work, unlike Jaspers, which, of course, is written in somewhat technical philosophical language and is certainly more dense than what people are used to reading today, and unlike Robert Bellah, who's putting forward a very, very ambitious theory as to what this axial age is, where it came from, the human evolutionary processes that led to it, Karen Armstrong tells a story. Now, she tells it from a sort of liberal feminine perspective, and she seems, like most ideologues, to find what she wants in the axial age, which for her was the flowering of human altruism, human empathy, the ability to sacrifice oneself for the other. And it's not that this isn't present, but there were many, many other elements to this period. Nevertheless, Karen Armstrong, without a doubt, put together the most beautiful description of the axial age that I'm aware of. So I'd certainly urge you, if this is a topic that interests you, to look at her work first, because it gives you the human tale before going into all of the theoretical considerations. A little bit of the detail of the axial age. Who were these people? Why are they important? You don't really need much explanation, but I think it's good to at least look at them for review. The Greek philosophers represented a profound shift in the culture of the Mediterranean, and even though we today, at least not most, don't worship Zeus, don't revere Athena outside of, say, the Acropolis down the road, we have left behind the Greek religion, but we certainly have not left behind the spirit of Greek inquiry, of philosophy, of debate. And a lot of the foundational notions that were put forward in, say, Plato, which derived from Socrates and also derived from Pythagoras, as Plato was initiated into the Pythagorean order, ideas such as mathematics, which transcend our material reality, ideas such as the fruitfulness of a dialectic or a debate in achieving some awareness, some consciousness of that generalizable reality above our transient material circumstances. This, of course, came from Socrates. Socrates, notorious for badgering and battering people on the Acropolis with questions, endless questions, never taking anything for granted. And of course, Socrates laid down a paradigm of martyrdom as something respectable, something worthy of elevation. When he was forced to drink the hemlock and kill himself under accusation of being an atheist, which in Athens simply meant to not believe in the gods as is proper. And so Plato is the essence, I think, of the Greek axial age, but the succession is quite long. One of the more important ideas that Plato put forward is the idea of the one, or God. And this has its precedent in previous philosophers from around the Mediterranean, so that the philosopher Thales, for instance, looked out at the world he was studying and was looking for what the common element was, what tied it all together. And somewhat metaphorically, he arrived at the conclusion that it was water, that all fundamentally is water. And the philosopher Heraclitus, the fragments of his statements are extremely beautiful and extremely compelling, whether you agree with them or not. Ideas such as, you can't step into the same river twice, meaning that all is flux, all is movement. But beneath that flux, beneath that movement, Heraclitus believed that all is fire, and that there's a flame burning within every single being that unifies the cosmos. And the philosopher Anaximander, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and any Greek students here are free to correct me afterwards, believed that all was ultimately the eperon, this energy, the substance that was infinite in its nature, so that all at its core was infinity, but everything that we see is shaped by mind, nous. And that mind, one might say that that idea is a kind of a foreshadowing of Plato's later ideas of God, of the one. And Plato had a peculiar idea of God. Of course, he presented it as a dialogue. He presented it as an argument. But you can see, for instance, in the idea of the demiurge, how peculiar it may be to the Christian monotheistic mind. Plato believed, of course, that these mathematics, that this music of the spheres, of the celestial eternal bodies, was a world of forms, and that in fact everything that we are and everything we see in front of us is simply an expression of those eternal forms, so that a human, or even a table, certainly a tree or an animal or a plant, has some corresponding form in the heavens. But he looked also above what we see to higher forms, forms that are sensed only with the mind, with the nous. And those, of course, are what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, or justice. Things that can't necessarily be apprehended physically, but exist somewhere and can be accessed by the mind. And he believed that the highest of these forms was the good, and that at the pinnacle of these forms was the one, or God. But he also believed that this physical world that we live in was not created by this higher unified God, that this physical world that we live in was created by a demiurge, or a craftsman who looked at the trestle board of the forms and drew or carved this world out of it. And because the demiurge is not explicitly described as, but obviously flawed, this world that we live in is perishable. We die. We're imperfect. Everything is a little bit messed up. But above this is that one. Above this is something, a one that is not just simply sitting and standing above Greek culture, such as Zeus, or even above, say, Hindu culture, such as Indra. Certainly not a tribal god, but a one that transcends all of these, a one God that is above all creation. And it's a peculiar point of view, but it would leach into Christian thinking. In fact, many of Plato's thoughts are foundational for Orthodox Christianity. To give you just one example, the idea of a psyche, or a soul. Now, there are certainly disagreements among Christians today, but you don't find this idea of this transcendent self that moves from this body to another form in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, or really not in any clearly delineated way in the New Testament. This is really the descent of Plato and Neoplatonists, this idea of the psyche that would pass from form to form. And for Plato, to the extent we can believe that he believed his own writings, his own dialogues, his own argumentation, believed that the self, or the psyche, passed from body to body through transmigration or reincarnation. At the very end, for instance, of the Republic, he gives a very detailed description of reincarnation, of how it is that souls, having died and gone to the next world, would either ascend to the heavens for a time or descend to the hells for a time, in order to sort of pay off their karma. And once they had done so, or used up the good karma, would come back, lots would be thrown, and they would be born into new bodies later on. So that's a really rough sketch of the Greek axial age. And it stands in sharp contrast to the Hebrew axial age, the Hebrew prophetic tradition. You know already that, for instance, at the beginning, at the origin of the Hebrew prophetic tradition, you don't have an imperfect demiurge drawing from the forms the world into existence. No, you have one single all-powerful God, or to the extent that you consider perhaps the Elohim as being plural, maybe something a little different. But this God, Yahweh or Elohim, speaks the world into existence. And yet there is this similarity in that there's this common origin, this common wellspring from which all existence arises. And you know the story that unfolds in Genesis and throughout the Torah and moving into the kingdoms and then the prophets. It's as if the Hebrew writers could kind of foresee or perceive cultural evolution from the most primitive in the Garden of Eden in the early generations, moving into larger tribal states such as those found in the Judges or in Judges. And then the creation of a monarchy in the shadow of empire. Now, you know also that the story of the monarchy is a tragic one. It was one that was asked for by the Hebrews and granted by God. But in the end, going from David down to Solomon, so on, this monarchy, which would continue over many generations, was almost from the beginning, really from the beginning, corrupted, and didn't abide by the one standard that God put forward, and so they were crushed. They were led out of Egypt by Moses from slavery, but because they didn't fulfill the covenant that they had agreed to with God, or had, at the very least, put upon them by God, you had first, in the 8th century, the Assyrians, fierce warriors, descending on the north kingdom of Israel, and destroying everything. And to the extent there is any archaeological record, it would seem that it was horrific. Practices such as killing the men and cutting their heads off and throwing their heads over the walls into the city to intimidate them and let them know that their time was up. And then you had the expansion of the Babylonian Empire and the destruction of the southern kingdom, Judah and Jerusalem. And Zedekiah, if I remember correctly, the last king, taken into Babylon, and his sons killed in front of him, and his eyes gouged out, so that would be the last thing he ever saw. Very cruel times. And in the ancient world, people would assume that if another civilization came and conquered yours, it was because their gods were more powerful. Why was Egypt strong enough to come and enslave you? Because Ra or Osiris or whatever regional god at the time was elevated as the Egyptian ultimate god was stronger than your god. And the same would go for, say, Marduk in the Babylonians. Why were the Babylonians able to crush the southern kingdom? The typical answer would simply be because they were stronger. Their gods were stronger. Kind of Darwinian notion of what divinity really is. Power, empire, kingship. But that's not the interpretation that comes out of the Old Testament. That's not the interpretation that comes out of the prophets, and it's very unique in that sense. There's self-reflection. There's self-accusation. There is a questioning of what one's ultimate rulers have done, your own kings, but also a questioning of the gods who came and conquered you. The Hebrews refused to believe that the other gods, whether it was Osiris or Ra or Marduk or whoever, that the other gods were in fact stronger. They were simply sent by the highest God to punish and to chasten the Israelites. And there's, of course, the possibility of redemption, which did in fact occur. The Babylonian exile goes from the beginning of the 6th century on down to, somebody help me with my dates here, I believe the 4th century. But the king of Persia, Cyrus, conquers the Babylonians and frees the Israelites, allowing them at the end of the Axial Age to reestablish something like their old kingdom, something like their old physical temple in the Levant. And this is a kind of resurrection of the temple, a resurrection of the body, so to speak. And that story of one's own sins being the root of pain, is again emblematic of the Axial Age. Now, I regrettably am going to kind of pass over the Zoroastrians in Persia just for the sake of time, but just know that the Zoroastrian thinking certainly would come to pervade the ideas and theologies of the Jews, the later Christians, and definitely the Muslims. But they were also deeply connected to the Hindu tradition and the Indian tradition as a whole. To the best that archaeologists and philologists, linguists can determine, there was a long, protracted invasion from what we now know as Russia, or that area, the steppes north of the Caucasus Mountains, of what were known as the Aryans, the nobles, into Persia, into Greece, and into India. And that shared culture, that shared origin is readily identifiable across these cultures. I'll give you one example there before moving on to the real axial element in India. In the Zoroastrian tradition, in the Persian tradition, the higher beings of light and of truth were known as ahuras, and the dark beings of falsehood and treachery were known as the devas, most likely where we now get the word devil. In the Hindu tradition, in the ancient Hindu tradition, which would extend through the Buddhist tradition, they called their high gods, the gods of light, the gods of goodness and truth, the devas. And they called the demons of sorts, they're much more like the titans of the Greek culture, the more morally ambiguous, but they called their demons, so to speak, the asuras. And it's pretty clear, along with a number of other linguistic connections, that this just represents a split between these cultures and a kind of relativizing in which, quite literally, our gods are your devils and vice versa. Now, in that Vedic culture, the culture of the warrior kings that descended from the Caucasus Mountains and overtook the dark-skinned peoples of India, you had an emphasis on bloodline, so that one's birth marked one's moral value. You had an emphasis on social hierarchy, so that you had the priests at the top, you had the warrior kings below, you had the merchant class below that, and you had the servant class below that. But outside of that very well-established hierarchy, that very well-established structure, were these renunciates, these people who were wandering off and meditating in the forest, relinquishing their worldly lives in order to attain some sort of higher consciousness. These lives are recorded in some detail in the Upanishads. And the Upanishads just seems, it means in the Sanskrit to sit at the feet of. So it is to sit at the feet of a teacher. And teachers such as Yajnavalkya or Uddaleka, and then later Mahavir and Buddha, these teachers taught a strange doctrine. It was present in its seed form in the Vedas, but it would come to full fruition in this Upanishadic era, which was at the heart of the Axial Age. And there are a few different assumptions that you're very familiar with. The idea of karma, the idea that one's actions will linger on and then come back to you, whether in this life or in the next and in the next. And there was this idea of samsara, that this birth and re-death, this birth and death and rebirth and death and re-death and rebirth over and over again was something that had to be escaped. Because no matter how much karma you built up, no matter how well your priests performed the rituals, no matter how many good deeds or deeds of conquest you performed and got up to the heavens, the idea was that your good karma would eventually run out. And the good news is that no matter how horrible your deeds, and no matter how deep you went into the hells, that karma would run out and you would come back, but it was just endless and miserable in their conception of things. And so they sought freedom, they sought moksha, liberation. And among those sages or ascetics that are described in the Upanishads, you had two ideas that would eventually merge. The first was that if you strip away everything that is yourself, layer by layer by layer, beginning with your social form out here among you, into your sensory, physical, corporeal form, into your deeper spiritual self, the saying was neti neti, not this, not this. Who am I? I'm not this. I'm not the person in your mind. I'm not the person standing here physically. I'm not the person I imagine myself to be, nor am I my thoughts, nor am I anything except for some seed, some root of being. And they called this the Atman, a kernel, a self. And the Atman is eternal. The Atman is a sort of vortex of experience, of being and consciousness and bliss that lies beneath all of the transient forms, which you will find very familiar from Plato's way of thinking. Different, but familiar. And that Atman is what really passes from life to life. Death cannot touch it. Nothing, pain, sorrow, nothing can touch it. It is eternal. It is immortal and will continue on, either from life to life or into freedom through moksha, through self-denial and the doing of one's duty, the doing of one's dharma. And the second idea was that if you look out into the universe from the transient forms up to the eternal forms in the heavens, if you look out into the universe, you'll also find something unifying it, something eternal. And they called it Brahman, a fire, the fire that burns within the stars and within the sun in the eternal realm. And then as these thoughts were being sort of synthesized and passed from teacher to teacher through students and through communication and argument, came the idea of the identity of the Atman with the Brahman. The idea that one's self, one's eternal self, is the same as the eternal self in each person out there, and the same as the eternal self in the stars, and that in fact there is just simply one self. And that this that we see today, this transient world, is a corruption, or in brighter terms, a kind of dream of God that we're all living in. And the way out is through doing one's duty, and at the ultimate, in the renunciate form, to conquer the outward forms and identify and become only that inward form, that Atman, that pure light, that pure self. Now, the Buddha comes out of all this. And the Buddha is interesting because he basically takes many of these assumptions and flips them on their heads. He was, of course, born a prince, but upon seeing sickness, old age, and death, he became disillusioned with the world of the senses and even his own royal privilege. And in the fourth sight, beyond disease, old age, and death, he saw a renunciate wandering, and he decided to join them. And so he left his royal position behind, and he began to study there are two primary teachers. One of them, I wish I'd given myself more time, but one of them, the descendant most likely of the Mahavira, who taught him to mortify himself, to starve his passions to the point of weakness. And another who taught him to unify his consciousness with the wider consciousness. But neither of these satisfied him. Neither of them, he believed, truly led to liberation. And he then rejected not only his royal lineage, but also at the time the highest spiritual teachings, and famously drank or ate a bowl of rice in order to give himself physical strength for the task ahead, and sat under a Bodhi tree near the holy city of Varanasi in India, or Benares, as it's otherwise known. And he set about meditating to find what the true nature of reality is. I'll just give you a very, very quick sketch of it. But in essence, the Buddha determined that it was in fact desire that leads to suffering. The problem, suffering. The root, desire. The solution, to extinguish suffering. But part of extinguishing suffering is to realize that there is no Atman. There is no eternal self. Nothing is eternal. All is flux. The concept of anatman is central to Buddhism. And although he believed in the gods, because the gods are interacting with him all the time, and even evil demonic spirits, there is no concept of one overarching, overruling God. It is simply up to each individual to save his or herself and to leave behind the world and come to what's known as enlightenment, which will lead to nirvana, blowing out the flame of desire. And he was asked, a lot of people think, okay, this is nihilism. It sounds like that on the surface, but I think that one of his answers, and he always gave these strange cryptic answers to questions, one of his answers to the question when he was near his death, where will you go when you die? What will you become? What is nirvana? And he said, it is neither existent, nor non-existent, nor not existent, nor not non-existent. Simply beyond all concept, all measure, but attainable. And as I mentioned before, the formation, and this is in the 4th century, probably, maybe the 5th. So long before the formation of Christian monasteries, you had the formation of the Sangha, the Buddhist monastic community. And it has had obviously profound impacts not only on Asia and the culture of the East, but with the kind of breaking open of Western civilization to the East in the last century, also on our own. And I'll hit very briefly China, mainly briefly for a number of reasons. One, the constraint of time, but also because China is much less familiar to me. It's much more alien. I don't really understand it fully. Not that I understand any of these cultures fully, but China is the most indecipherable to me. But one thing certainly happened is, not unlike the emergence of the Axial Age from the Greek culture in the shadow of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, and also the war with the Persians, and not unlike the trials of violence that the Hebrews went through, the Chinese, just prior to the beginnings of their Axial Age, went through a warring states period in which there was horrific and brutal violence described in some detail in the ancient Chinese writing. And it was emerging from that you get Confucius and you get Lao Tzu. And these, I think, are oftentimes held as opposite poles of Chinese religious culture, and rightly and wrongly. It's not as simple as that. Both believed, for instance, in heaven and earth as supreme beings. Both believed that the balance of all forces is to be found in the Tao. Oftentimes you'll see it expressed in the yin-yang, the Tao or the way, simply the way of all things, that origin of all things, that one at the fountainhead of all existence. But Confucius took a very different approach. Confucius was much more focused on social propriety, on ritual, on the proper ritual, because it's only through the proper ritual that men can truly become themselves. It's only through the proper ritual that men can then grow to be spontaneous with one another. And he also taught the 5 relationships which were to order society, which were the ruler and the subject, the husband and the wife, the older brother and the younger brother, the friend and the friend, and a 5th, which somewhere out in the Brahman, somewhere out in the forums exists, but has left my mind completely. So you'll have to look that one up for yourselves. But you get the point. You get the idea. It's through this proper ordering of society and this proper relationship and the proper conduct of the ritual that Confucius believed society could be rebuilt. And yes, it would still have a king, and yes, it would still have its priests, but he held as the highest ideal the chunsa, the gentleman, the man who has cultivated himself, who has carved his block, who has made himself useful to his fellow men, who has made himself useful to the ruler and to his family, the cultivated man. On the outskirts of this are the Taoists. You're probably familiar with the book, the Tao Te Ching, the book of the Tao, the book of the way and its power. And the story, the very brief story, and this one just fits into a nutshell anyway, Lao Tzu was an archivist at the court, the royal court. And he became completely frustrated with the corruption of the political system, and so he left. But as he was leaving the city, he was stopped by a guard at the gate who told him that he could not leave unless he told the guard what the secret was. What is it that's driving you? What is the secret of the Tao? And so he composed, according to the story, 81 verses which form the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching are in many ways a jab at the Confucians. The Tao Te Ching says, no, the way is not to be found in civilization and its rituals and its rules and its order. The way comes from the world of nature outside. The way is the way of the Tao coming through heaven, through earth, and then the 10,000 things. And any civilization that's worthwhile will be built from a unity or a coherence with nature. And so you have these poles and you have their descendants. And from this axial age in China, you have, up until the Communist Revolution, what would define the Chinese soul, with the introduction, of course, of Buddhism, which was driven out of India. So again, just to recap what the central elements of this axial age are, you've got the elevation of the individual over and against the established social order. You have the sense that that order is above and beyond all of the different tribal or national or even imperial cultures. You have the cultivation of individuals who will leave the society to some extent or another and intentionally cultivate themselves in order to find the connection to a transcendent realm that is the origin of and the goal of our lives here on earth. And in our own culture, in the Western culture, the Hebrew and the Greek axial ages would emerge as Christianity. I'm not saying that you had some cabal that intentionally scripted the story of Jesus to mirror these or established the church in order to imitate these, but undoubtedly the Greek stream and the Hebrew stream converge on Jesus, on Christ. And in the image of Jesus, in the image of Christ, you have the image of a man who, like Socrates, would not submit to worldly order over and above that which is absolute, God. And like Socrates would be killed for that rigid clinging to what is right and what is good, what is true and what is beautiful over and above the transient world. And I just want to leave you with a sense of how deeply connected these are in three passages. One from the Buddha from the 5th, maybe 4th century BC, one from Jesus, and one from Lao Tzu. And in the sayings of the Buddha, the Dhammapada, we read, all that we are is the result of what we thought. All is mind. If a man speaks or acts with an evil thought, pain follows him, as the wheel follows the foot of the ox that draws the carriage. If a man speaks or acts with a pure thought, happiness follows him, like a shadow that never leaves him. And then he laments and quotes, he abused me, he beat me, he defeated me. In those who harbor such thoughts, hatred will never cease. But in those who do not harbor such thoughts, hatred will cease. For hatred does not cease by hatred at any time. Hatred ceases by love. This is an old rule. And some 4 or 5 centuries later, we hear Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount say, referring back to the Mosaic law, "You've heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And like I say, the Chinese are a bit more alien. And this, of course, is a translation from the Chinese into English, which is going to lose something. But this comes from the Tao Te Ching, roughly the same time as the Buddha, worlds and worlds away. And speaking of the Tao, Lao Tzu says, "The highest good is like water. Water gives life to the 10,000 things and does not strive. It flows in places men reject, and so is like the Tao, the way. The sage has no mind of his own. He is aware of others. I am good to people who are good. I am also good to people who are not good. The sage is shy and humble. To the world, he seems confusing." And these ways of being, if they existed before the Axial Age, were simply not recorded in any detail. And they were not adopted wholesale by the subsequent societies over the last 2 millennia plus. They simply have come down to us in these images, these icons of the prophets, of the philosophers, of the ascetics, and of the sages, slowly moving into a system that remained established, a hierarchy in which, of course, violence and wealth and territory, the 4 F's, remain at the top, but softening them, shifting them, changing them. And so, to conclude, of what value is this to us? You know, Karl Jaspers, when he wrote of this in the late 40s, he juxtaposed the Axial Age with the technological civilization around him, with the rise of the machines of war that could wreak the devastation of World War II, that could lead to communism and fascism, that could lead to nuclear annihilation. And he juxtaposed this with that tension that you see in the individuals of the Axial Age, that tension of some self that is in alignment with a higher transcendent realm that could continually combat and perhaps even transform the hardness of that machine. And the philosopher of technology or historian of technology, Lewis Mumford, saw much the same thing. He saw the ancient world as a sort of mega machine, a system of humans that were made to be cogs, say in Egypt or even in the Shang dynasty. And he believed the Axial Age was a rebellion of the human spirit against it. And he believed that possibly this could be, and he was an atheist, but he believed that possibly this sort of softness and this sort of split, this belief in something that transcends what is and could become what should be, might inform the completely absorbing and controlling world of machines that he was describing in the 60s. And so now as we move into whatever it is we're moving into, whether it's truly a transhuman age or simply an age dominated by gadgets, controlled by the wealthy, I truly do believe that there is inspiration in these philosophers. There is inspiration in the prophets and in the ascetics and in the sages and in the priests. And I think that the world that they describe, that world of the transcendent that comes through the soul, is in fact a vehicle for power, for resisting everything that comes down around us and brings out the worst in us. As it's been said, one must be in the world but not of the world. And that spectrum from in the world completely, so that you are constantly driven by its desires, to being completely not of the world, so that one is completely transcended, supposedly, all these desires. None of us are going to be on either of those extremes. All of us are going to be somewhere in between. But to the extent that your life is made better by at least resisting the worst of what is of the world and embracing what is best that is not of this world, one does come to some sense of peace. One does come to some sense of wholeness. Hopefully one is able to realize justice and realize oneself. Hopefully one can, in fact, love God as oneself and can love one's neighbor as oneself. And with that, I appreciate your attention. Thank you very much.